Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Hey folks, thanks for joining us again for another episode of the Brave New Weed podcast. We have a great guest tonight, Dr. Ethan Russo, who's just an amazing scientist and raconteur and explorer of the world. But before that, I want to say hi to Matthew, our co-host.
Greetings from Germany, Joe.
Welcome. You're in Germany or in Austria? I thought you were in Austria.
I have been in Austria, but currently I'm in Germany on my way to Belgium. Had a great couple of days in Austria and found out that there's quite a nice underground culture of homegrown cannabis going on in Austria.
There's a culture of homegrown cannabis going on all over the world. No matter where I go, I run into people who are so pleased to tell me they're growing stuff in their closet or in their backyard, or they've been growing for hundreds, not hundreds of years, but they've been growing ever since they were kids. It's really fascinating. It is, no matter what the laws do, there will always be homegrown, which is sort of a nice, comforting thought, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Austria is going through some interesting times, issues with some immigration stuff, and I think that from an enforcement standpoint, they've kind of backed away from enforcing casual use and personal use cannabis. And it's interesting to see that some people are getting involved in that.
Good. I'm glad to hear it's happening all over the world. So we have a few bills to pay. You want to tell us about our sponsors, our new sponsors, our exciting expansions, Matthew?
Yeah, happily. We're excited to announce that this is the first episode of the Brave New Weed podcast that will be featured in syndication on thefreshtoast.com.
That's a new relatively new web publication based out of Seattle. It's primarily a lifestyle publication with cannabis in the background. Sort of a cool and interesting idea. So I'm very happy to be affiliated with them, and I hope their listeners enjoy this as much as ours do.
Yeah, I was perusing the site a bit earlier. Lots of great stuff about food and drink and culture and how culture and cannabis are coming together. So I'm very happy that we can be a part of it.
Lovely. And who else is with us these days? Death Wish Coffee, right?
Yeah, Death Wish Coffee, guys, still hanging in.
The strongest coffee I've ever... It is really powerful coffee. What's the deal? They pump caffeine into it?
No, absolutely not. No artificial additives, no additional caffeine. It is 100% a product of the choice of the mix of beans and their proprietary roasting process. They do all their own in-house roasting, and they've dialed it in and worked it out to be legitimately and verified the strongest coffee in the world.
Yeah, it definitely works. That's for sure. You ready to do some news?
Absolutely. We'll roll a quick spot for the Death Wish Fueled by Deathcast, their proprietary podcast that you can check out. And right after that, we'll be back with some news.
Whoa, how did we get on this podcast?
I'm not sure, but I like it here.
It's pretty great, but we should probably tell everyone about our own podcast, Fueled by Deathcast.
Hell yeah. Comes out every Thursday from the Death Wish Coffee Company, the world's strongest coffee.
Every week you can hear me, the Incredible Jeff.
And me, the amazing D-Man.
And we talk about new science discoveries, breaking news from Death Wish Coffee, and we welcome a special guest from rock stars to astronauts and ask them all the question, what fuels you?
The podcast is available right on deathwishcoffee.com and wherever podcasts are found, including iTunes, Google Music, Stitcher, and more.
Plus, you can now watch it live on the Death Wish Coffee Company page on Facebook and watch all our videos over on YouTube.
All right. Now you know all about Fueled by Deathcast and how you can listen to it.
But first, let's finish this podcast.
Let's get back to the show.
So this was a really bad week in Northern California because at least 200,000 acres were burned around Santa Rosa, California. Now that included a whole lot of vineyards and a whole lot more cannabis farms. This is really bad for growers in California for lots of reasons. First of all, they're struggling with regulation and trying to get into the system. Farmers and growers are not the most regulatory minded of people. So that's been a battle. Secondly, these farmers are, of course, not insured. So they are likely to be wiped out, which is really terrible. Really, really sad. And there's not much right now that the government is going to do for them. That's for sure.
It's got to be a tough situation, right? Where you're involved in a state that is coming online to legalize, but in fact are still running what would be considered a clandestine activity. I don't know who you would be able to turn to.
It's painful. I mean, all we can turn to is some good companies who are going to do, like Cannacraft, this Santa Rosa business. They donated $50,000 worth of medical cannabis to the victims, but that's not going to really take care of the problems of losing all these crops. There was one joke that I don't think this is funny at all, but there was one joke that came up about there's going to be new strains. One's called Hickory Kush. So I know it's like a really sad joke, I think.
Low blow,
very low blow. Anyway, I'm feeling very bad for the farmers and the growers and for all the folks affected by this. So we send them.
Well, and if anybody out there who's a fan of the show, if you are directly affected, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you. We'd love to get your story out. We want our listeners to know what you're going through. So please contact us and let's see how we can spread the word about the actual on the ground impacts of these fires.
Good idea. The other sort of interesting news of the week was that a university. This is completely off different tact. University in Michigan called Northern Michigan University has now launched a full 4-year cannabis degree program. Can you believe that?
Well, now I'm trying to digest this. This is a very different thing than like an Oaksterdam type or cannabis college, right? This is a different approach to.
So this is actually a really interesting program because it combines chemistry, biology, botany, horticulture, marketing, and finance. And if you think about it, this is a brand new industry. Like, where do you go to learn about what's going on?
Right. And I think it seems that, we've had things that are like, oh, here's how to grow, and people who have been growing and that kind of stuff are like, oh, here you can go and learn to bake edibles or something along this line. But the actual science, the actual chemistry, and the business behind marijuana production, I mean, it almost sounds like the world's first vocational technical school program for cannabis.
Well, it sort of is. I mean, I guess if you're in the wine industry, you might, I don't think you would take a college course, but you would learn a whole lot about the growing and the agriculture of wine. So this is actually a very interesting course. I reached out to one of the professors there, and hopefully he'll come on the show and tell us a little more.
Michigan only has medical, but it's like a very narrow medical program,
very
right?
narrow. But, again, speaking of home growers, Michigan is a huge place of cannabis cultivation. So, you will now be able to go to college there and get a degree.
Sounds interesting.
Third bit of news came from our friend Marvin Washington, former football player, now cannabis activist. And he sent me a note this week saying that, hey, this amendment called the Rohrbacher-Farr Amendment, now called Rohrbacher-Blumenhour. This is the amendment that protects all medical cannabis users and distributors from the federal government from interfering with their medication, basically. Or you might say protects them from Jeff Sessions, who seems to want to interfere with their medical treatment. Anyway, this is a tricky issue. The amendment has to continually be passed by Congress, and there's some concern that it's in peril.
Well, and it's a budgetary amendment, right? This is saying that states or that the federal government cannot actually spend any money to contradict state law in terms of cannabis.
That's right. That's how it's protecting all the patients in the medical programs. But it has to come up for vote by Congress, and it has to be passed by the Senate and the House. And, there's a lot of people who are not pro-cannabis in these institutions. So I want to introduce Tammy Wall and Safira Galoob, who are two incredible women. They have the only dedicated lobbying firm based in Washington dedicated to the cannabis industry. And they are on the Hill lobbying, trying to prevent the peril from happening. So we spoke to them briefly, and I want to let you hear what we had to say. So Tammy and Safira, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I want to just start with explaining what Rohrbacher-Blumenhour, which was formerly known as Rohrbacher-Farr, is. Let's tell the listeners how it actually works, please.
Thank you, Joe. The Rohrbacher-Farr Amendment has been industry's first line of defense to ensure some state autonomy and protecting those programs, the medicinal programs, from federal interference, primarily coming from the DOJ. So it's been an amazing amendment that was many years in the making, and Congressman Rohrbacher has been the champion for that amendment.
So it's very interesting because Rohrbacher is an arch conservative on almost every single issue. He and I agree on nothing except for this one amendment. How did it begin? What was his journey into it quickly?
Well, certainly California has been not just leadership within the United States, but globally in its protection of and access to medicinal cannabis. And in addition to constituency pressure, Mr. Rohrbacher is an avid states' rights proponent, which is not an uncommon position for conservatives. So combining those two motivations, states' rights and access to medicinal cannabis for his population, he really rose to champion the industry in this movement to protect the state programs.
It's very interesting, really. But tell me, so I've heard that the amendment is in peril. I don't know if you would describe it as such, but can you please explain what that means to me?
So peril is definitely a word that could evoke emotion for industry, and that's understandable. I don't know that we would describe it as being in peril. I think it's in a different state in the legislative process, and I'm happy to go into that a little bit for.
Yes, please.
Different people have different kind of appetites for how much detail they want on this. But sometimes when I talk to folks about the legislative process, I refer to the "I'm just a bill, I'm only a bill." Remember those days? And the House and the Senate each get their version of language before a bill becomes a law. This bill comes through a process called the appropriations process, where the government receives its funding. And in years past, this language was in both the House bill and the Senate bill before the law was passed. Versus this year, it's only in the Senate bill supported by Senator Leahy. It's not in the House bill.
And so because of that dynamic, that it's only coming out of the Senate and not the House, industry, being the stakeholders that are the voice right now for industry in Washington, D.C., there's a concerted effort to garner support from leadership to make sure that Leahy's language makes it into that final budget package. And that's the immediate concern, and at times that's interchanged with being in peril, but that is the immediate effort.
So is there a deadline on this? Does this have to happen by a certain date?
Well, there's a little bit of fluidity in congressional calendaring, as you probably see just watching the news. We're looking at ensuring that the support, the demonstration of support, as many Republicans as we can to leadership, but also to kind of get ourselves organized as industry advocates within the next few weeks. It's not that there's a hard deadline. Industry is likely looking at December 8th as a hard deadline because, not to veer off from this, but currently industry is being protected via prior language, which is what we refer to as Rohrbacher-Farr, Mr. Farr's support, and that is through what we call a continuing resolution. So the idea is that industry has its support now via what they may hear as a CR, that's the continuing resolution, but what we're fighting for and what you refer to as possibly in peril is language moving forward for the next year's appropriations.
So what happens if this doesn't happen? What happens if there is no language in this bill?
Well, that's a good question, and I think the unknown is probably what is putting industry, one in a state of anxiety and in a state of unknown. But I think, and being on the Hill, so Tammy and I are in D.C., and we're on the Hill 3 to 4 days a week, and we work with the trade associations and other advocates in the space, and so we really are in the nuanced discussions. And I use the concept black helicopters. We do not see there will be an urgent reaction if it is not included in the bill. I mean, we're not thinking that way, but let's just hypothetically engage that dialogue in a just in case. The first is that justice and the DEA does not have the bandwidth to take the industry down. I mean, that's kind of a given. And our latest White House hire, General Kelly, has indicated as such in his April 16th discussions. The industry is protected in a sense by the other competing, more urgent interests that justice has for our country. Secondly,
like deporting immigrants. Is that what you mean?
No, that's exactly right, Joe. And to that,
I'm not about mincing words here, women. I'm about calling it like it is here.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And to that particular point, not only does the DEA have limited bandwidth, but because of all those other very divisive issues, whether it's on the Climate Alliance, immigration, sanctuary cities, DACA, whatever those issues might be, the states have really rallied around the citizens and the constituency within their borders. And cannabis is very much falling in alignment with that. So states' rights has always been an issue, although we are now seeing governors, secretaries of state, certain AGs, and other agency leadership on the state level stepping up and in a kind of a looser vernacular saying, we have your back.
Good. Glad to know it. I mean, I think it's important to remind the listeners that no medical state is a medical state because of an edict. All the voters in these 30 states elected to have this there, right? This is directly as a result of voter will.
Absolutely. Voice and vote of the strongest constituency, the people within a state. And I want to add one other piece that I think is very important, both for listeners as well as for states who are concerned about this. I mean, we are seeing legislation within the states where the states themselves are defunding the facilitation of any justice or DEA prosecution. So the idea is that, let's say justice wanted to come in and prosecute, the state's saying, good luck, go ahead and try, we're not going to support you. And that creates an additional dynamic. Tammy and I will frequently play in these hypotheticals, and another reality is that if it weren't included, there is still an opportunity to act with other types of legislation to react that it wasn't there. So it's not included. So it is certainly inconvenient, and one of the unfortunate elements about this discussion for this language to be in what we call the appropriation cycle, which is an annual renewal, is that industry is kind of unable to focus on other more substantive things that are impacting industry, banking.
It's a diversion, definitely. It's a diversion of energy in an already stressed out industry. Tell me quickly, what's the urgency here and what should we do?
I think the urgency is that it is the Republican lawmakers from whom we need to hear, and leadership needs to hear from them. So if your listeners are in communities where they have Republican congressional members, and I'll use California for an example, there are 14 Republican congressional members, and only 3 of them are really openly supporting the industry right now. That's a travesty, in my opinion.
Okay. Yep.
Right now, industry advocates, including the liaison group and the trade associations and other lobbyists, are working together for a letter signed by Republicans and Democrats, but right now we're working on the Republican signatures to signal to leadership that this is law, it should remain law, and it has bipartisan support to respect states and protect patients.
So what can I do? What can the listeners do? How can we help you?
I think making sure that if listeners have access to Republican congressional members is to call them and let them know to sign the Rohrbacher-Blumenhour Dear Colleague letter.
Okay. Sign the letter.
Yep, to sign the letter. And in part because of how our legislative, on the calendar, this may be the only opportunity for a congressional member from a jurisdiction. So we have the 30 states with medicinal programs and an additional 16 states with limited programs. So a majority of our country is right now in a jurisdiction with some type of either a legal constituent or a legal compound from that cannabis plant. So, and the other states that are not online are coming online. So this may be the only opportunity for that congressional member to show support for for what's going on the state level.
Gotcha. On a scale of 1 to 10, last question, how urgent is it that we do something here?
10.
There you go. Thank you very much for your insight, and thank you very much for your work on the Hill.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks for including us.
Thanks for that. Again, their company is called the Liaison Group, and they are the only dedicated lobbyists, the only lobbyists dedicated to the cannabis industry and cannabis issues currently in Washington. So they are really fighting the good fight. And I'm hoping to have them on in the near future to talk about really what it feels like to be in Washington right now with this hot button issue. What's really happening there? I feel like we need to have some on the ground report from them. So they're going to come back with us, I'm pretty sure. Now, our guest tonight is Dr. Ethan Russo. And, we all know that cannabis has a very memorable smell. Do you know why that is, Matthew?
I'm super excited that we actually get to have this episode because it's 100% terpenes.
Exactly. I know this is your favorite topic, but terpenes are...
I love it.
Terpenes are the powerful smell molecules that really direct the high and direct the healing. When I was younger, I used to think THC had the smell. And I got that really wrong because these THC and CBD and the cannabinoids are completely smell-free. It's these amazing smell molecules that combine, and that's what gives strains their particular odors and their unique smells. And it's also why things are named strawberry cough or super lemon haze. Things actually smell like other substances we know in nature. Terpenes are found in every plant, and they're really fascinating. And the way they work in cannabis is even more fascinating. And there's really nobody better to talk about terpenes than Ethan. So we dialed him in from Seattle, where he lives and works, and he's going to tell us all about these molecules. Are you excited?
I'm super excited. And I think it's something very important for a lot of people. You had said that you had thought that THC was causing the smell. I know a lot of people who still get confused by the indica versus sativa and how that is a basis for how cannabis is going to affect you. And so I'm really happy to learn everything we can from Ethan. But I also think for listeners out there that have just the slightest inkling of what's really going on inside the plant, that this is going to be wildly informational.
Look, it's a fascinating plant, and this is just yet another level of why it's so damn interesting. So let's talk to Ethan, okay? So Ethan, how would people today use cannabis for migraines? I mean, I know there's a lot of different types of migraines, so the question may be moot, but so many people suffer from these headaches. Sometimes they're blinding. Should they smoke or should they take a tincture? Should they do low dose, high dose? Should they eat it? What do you suggest?
Sure. Well, some of these things remain to be worked out. It seems like, again, it's quite well established, both historically and what we know from modern usage, that people can use it either way, as a preventive on a regular basis or as needed at the time. So it could be inhaled. I never recommend smoking, but vaporization certainly would be an alternative if someone felt the aura, the warning of a headache coming on. This can be an effective way to abort the migraine. But most interesting to me are the preventive approaches. Most of the research on migraine is for, I've got a headache, what do I take to try to stop it? And for many people who have these chronically and severely, that's a little bit after the fact. Rather, they often need ongoing medicine to really hopefully stop them, or at least cut down on the frequency and severity. So in that kind of situation, what we would most often recommend would be oral administration of a low dose of a cannabis extract, preferably cannabidiol predominant, perhaps a touch of THC, that would effectively help prevent them, but not be so psychoactive as to produce unwanted side effects that might impair someone's ability to work or study.
That's a common approach for many illnesses, dosing with cannabis. It starts with CBD, you add a little bit of THC, and see if it can either prevent or at least get you through the condition, right?
Oh, exactly.
But let's talk about a recent paper of yours I just read, which was pretty stunning. It was on terpenes. First of all, let's tell everyone what a terpene is. It's a strong smell molecule, an aroma molecule that seems to be very prevalent in cannabis.
Oh, yes.
What's your idea on how these terpenes medicinally work in the plant?
Well, sure. It's a situation where until recently, tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, got all the attention. And for decades, the government tried to present the premise that the pharmacology of cannabis was all about THC, where I think most medicinal consumers feel quite differently. It's only in the last few years that proper attention has been devoted to other components, particularly to cannabidiol. But then we've got a situation now where if someone is buying cannabis at a dispensary, chances are they're only getting information on the THC and perhaps the CBD content without reference to anything else. But as you mentioned, there are these aromatic compounds in cannabis called terpenoids. They're not unique to cannabis. A lot of plants that produce odors, such as citrus rinds, pine needles, many flowers produce terpenoids. But when these are ingested by whatever root in conjunction with THC, they exert sometimes synergistic benefits, or they may reduce side effects. But they really change the character of THC so that it's a much more effective and acceptable medicine.
The most common terpenes are lavender, pine, lemon, hops, black pepper, and clove. So to what extent can these smell molecules really work as medicine?
Well, first, let's establish something. I think that even scientists often tend to be skeptical of these, because when you go to look at the concentration of these in the plant, they tend to be really tiny. However, they're incredibly powerful. A few molecules of these are enough for your nose to pick up and recognize and perhaps evoke memories. You mentioned lavender. For a lot of older Americans, they'll smell lavender and they'll have memories of their grandmother because she used lavender sachets in the clothes drawer, things of this sort. So, they're working not just on our memory, but emotions and pharmacologically in the brain. And the thing that's remarkable to me is these tiny amounts, again, combined with THC, do remarkably different things than THC alone. I'm sure you're aware of the fact that THC as a synthetic has been marketed as Marinol in the U.S. since 1985. However, it's never had a lot of acceptance because THC alone is a really lousy drug. It's very difficult to tolerate. It produces dysphoria, unhappiness rather than euphoria, and it doesn't have a good therapeutic index. Therapeutic index is the difference between the dose that might reduce pain or other symptoms versus that produces side effects. And those are so tight together with THC alone that it just isn't useful, even for people who might have been cannabis experienced. To give an example, let's say that cannabis were used instead and there were an equivalent amount of THC, but there happened to be a little bit of pinene in it. Pinene is from pine needles. Pinene is very powerful in reducing the short-term memory impairment that THC produces. So for the patient who has to be able to function, work or study, this can make all the difference in their ability to do that if there happen to be pinene present. Similarly, if there's a little bit of limonene is a mood elevator. It's going to be familiar to anyone as lemon scent, and there's a reason when you walk down the aisle with a detergent in the supermarket that you're just beset with lemon scent. And that is because it is evocative in the human brain of cleanliness and sunlight and good things like that. And pharmacologically, it is a very powerful antidepressant.
It really is. A couple of things this raises. You go into a grow of cannabis, and it is a really significant odor. I would say it's pretty memorable. These are strong, strong smells, obviously. So are you saying that a typical sort of strain has enough of these molecules to really change the effect and direct it?
Oh, it sure does. But a grow room is pretty overwhelming. I mean, some people even get a headache under those conditions. It's a lot at one time. This would be in comparison to a tiny amount of the terpenoid fraction that might be present in an inhalation from a vaporizer or taken orally. So there's certainly some people who get into sensory overload if they're exposed to a large amount of cannabis growing at one time. But yes, to answer your question, a small amount can clearly have these kind of marked effects.
Do you believe in the strain classification system, or do you think it's just a load of bullshit?
Well, Joe, let's define our terms first. There is no such thing as a plant strain. Strains of bacteria or viruses, yeah, that nomenclature is correct. I prefer the term chemovar. Let's break that down. Chemovars are chemical varieties. So in common parlance, we hear a lot about sativa and indica. Sativa just means cultivated. So cannabis sativa is cannabated cultivus. Cultivated cannabis. Easy for me to say. Indica means cannabis that came from India. Well, in fact, these terms, there's so much interbreeding. If they ever were separate species, it's all pretty meaningless right now. What the consumer needs to know, or the physician that is trying to help them with their choice of medicine would need to know, is what is the chemical composition? What chemovar is this? In other words, what are the proportions of THC, of CBD? Is there pinene in it? Or rather, is there a lot of myrcene, which is by far the most predominant terpenoid seen in cannabis in North America, and it tends to be extremely sedating, so much so that when it's combined with THC, it produces a narcotic couch lock effect where people are immobilized. Well, that's great if you really need to relax or go to sleep, but it's not going to be what the patient needs. Again, if they've got to go to work or go to school, it just isn't going to cut it. So we need much better descriptions when people go to purchase cannabis for medicinal use to know what's in it. And so I believe in a classification of the chemovars, and I think people should forget about indica and sativa because how they're used in common parlance is absolute nonsense.
What are the most common terpenes in cannabis, and what are their names? I mean, listen, Super Lemon Haze to me is a pretty good description of limonene. What do you think?
Well, it might or might not be. The trouble is we're dealing with what is still a clandestine industry. And to be fair, not everyone is a scrupulous purveyor. I know for a fact that if Super Lemon Haze is selling well this week, that it's very easy for the grower to put that on the label when he's driving to the dispensary to sell his wares. I wish that this weren't true, but it is. And we know that there's tremendous variation, and I just don't think that's reliable. So these so-called strain names, what should be called chemovars, are very misleading. And I would prefer a system where maybe it has a funny name like that, but at the same time, the consumer has the ability to know what the biochemical composition is. And I would maintain with that kind of information, the consumer can have a really good idea of what it's likely to do to him or her.
Well, in a legal state, you can find that much more easily than in a state where I live, like in New York. I mean, you can't read a lab test in New York, but you certainly can in Seattle.
Well, all is not rosy in Washington State either. There's no requirement for terpenoid composition. And additionally, they're not mandating testing for pesticides and other things that should be done as a strict state safety measure.
So is your idea to be growing strains that are stronger in terpenes, like super terpene strains that are more powerful? I mean, right now it's strong terpenes are at about 0.5%.
Well, that would be really low. If you look at some of the older articles, they'll talk about 1% terpenoid content, but there was a recent article about testing of California chemovars, and they were seeing as high as 3.5%, and I know for fact that 5% has been exceeded. So yes, it is absolutely the case that one can selectively breed not only for higher terpenoid content, but for specific elevations. A high pinene chemovar, a high limonene chemovar, a high caryophyllene chemovar that would be especially good for treating inflammation or pain without adding to the psychoactivity, and actually could have an anti-addictive effect, particularly if it were combined with cannabidiol, which also has the ability to combat addictions to various substances.
Let's tell the listeners what beta-caryophyllene smells like.
It's a sort of balsamic scent, and I know that adjective may not help much, but it would smell sort of like a nice wood from South America. But it also is one of the scent components of black peppercorns, although that's a little more irritating than caryophyllene on its own. But this is a fascinating terpenoid because it's not just a terpenoid, it's also a cannabinoid in its own right. It works on the CB2 receptor. This is the non-psychoactive receptor, which is mainly in the periphery, but can be expressed in the brain under conditions of injury or inflammation. It is very therapeutic without making someone high at all.
So when we say the periphery, we mean the tissues in the body, right? We mean the organs, everything that's not the brain.
Right. So outside the nervous system.
That's interesting. What are some of the more common ones? What about myrcene? What smell would you identify that with?
Well, it's in hops. It's also in celery. That may not nail it down. It's not an unpleasant odor at all. But again, that's the sort of narcotic, sleep-inducing component that's so common in modern cannabis chemovars. But by no means is it all bad. It has anti-inflammatory and analgesic effects as well. In relation to its ability to fight pain, it's interesting because that benefit can be blocked with naloxone, the opiate blocker. So that's the same drug that they administer to someone who's overdosed on heroin out in the field. So when I say narcotic, it's advisedly because that is the effect that it will have if there's too much of this in conjunction with THC. So I would say that myrcene, while it's therapeutic, is something I'd like to see less of in medical chemovars, so that we could have more of these other components that may be more therapeutic.
What are some of the more therapeutic benefits of these things in higher concentrations? I mean, I know it's a guess because the research hasn't been done yet, but give me your best guess.
Well, we're trying to get those get proof of all this, but again, for boosting of the immune system and elevating mood, limonene is great. Pinene for a clear head and elimination of short-term memory impairment. Another common one is terpenylene, which increases the presence and the buzz, if you will. We're less knowledgeable about what the therapeutic effects might be there, but just because it hasn't been tested on its own. But I can tell you that with Ryan Vandrey, Vandrey, at Johns Hopkins, we recently got notice that after 20 years, we have an NIH grant approval to look at these synergies between THC and some of the terpenoids. So we will be doing formal testing in human volunteers over the next 3 years to try and prove some of these things that I guess have to be considered theories at this point.
What do you suspect?
Well, again, we've discussed some of the possibilities, but by testing people before and after vaporization of these different combinations, doing psychometric tests, memory tests, things of this sort, we should be able to show if there are salient differences.
So what does terpenylene smell like? Is that the base smell of turpentine?
It's one component. It smells better than turpentine, in my opinion. I find turpentine, which is a mixture, of course, a little bit nasty. So it does have terpenylene. It has a lot of pinene as well.
Ethan, you got your start looking at plants and became an ethnobiologist. How did you get into this, and where did it take you?
Well, my interest in medicinal plants started when I was a teenager. I was interested in the books by somebody named Yule Gibbons. He wrote a book called Stalking the Healthful Herbs. And I practiced some of this myself when I treated my poison ivy with something he recommended called jewel weed, which was really remarkably effective. But that interest fell by the wayside for a good while I went through college and medical school and residency training. But after I'd been in practice for about 7 years in 1990, it occurred to me that I was giving increasingly toxic drugs to my patients with less and less benefit, and it rekindled the interest in medicinal plants as possible alternatives. So at that point, I was very interested in migraine and looked into the ethnobotany of migraine around the world. As it turned out, the most medicinal plants used for migraine treatment were in the Amazon in South America. So after studying Spanish at night, eventually in 1994, I got to Peru for the first time. And then in 1995, I spent a 3-month sabbatical in the rainforest with a tribe called the Machigenga, studying their medicinal plant usage for headaches and other things.
How did they use plants? What kind of plants were they using, and how did they take them? They certainly didn't have pills.
Well, they have hundreds of plants. In just 2.5 months, with my research partner, we documented over 500 medicinal plants, and that wasn't by any means all that they used. But they use them to treat illnesses of every kind, including headache. They also used medicinal plants as fish poisons. They'd put these in the river, and the fish would come up to the surface to gulp air, at which time they'd shoot them with a bow and arrow. So it didn't kill the fish outright, but got them to the surface so they'd be accessible. Additionally, they use plants for divination as part of their religious observance, including ayahuasca, the vine of the soul. But there were very many plants used to treat headaches, and I was able to use these myself and see them used successfully in other people.
You suffered from headaches?
Yes. Fortunately, I didn't get a lot while I was there, but when I did, they had a leaf called psychotria, which, when crushed, wrapped in native cotton and wrapped then in banana leaf, could be dripped in the eye, and it would take care of the headache and associated symptoms, including sensitivity of the eyes to light, nausea, etc., in about 10 or 15 minutes.
So how would they apply it? How would they use it if they weren't smoking? What were they doing?
It was dripped into the eye.
Ah, into the eye. That's interesting. So they didn't really use cannabis in the rainforest, though, did they?
No, I did not see any cannabis, but they had plenty of other medicinal plants to utilize.
You're, as a doctor, and a doctor who deals with illegal substances, how do your colleagues tend to view this and what you do?
Well, mixed reception, certainly. Again, this was more than 20 years ago when I came back to Montana from the rainforest and began using medicinal plants in my practice. I'm sure that many of my colleagues thought I was crazy, but gradually they saw that I was getting results, and eventually they would refer patients to me if they wanted herbal alternatives. And that included cannabis eventually, because in 1996, when I returned from sabbatical, I quickly became embroiled in the cannabis controversy.
Do you still practice conventional medicine?
No, I've been on a different platform since 2003 in research and development. However, I hear from patients from all over the world, particularly about cannabis, but also other medicinal plants.
So do you consider yourself an herbalist? Do you use plants for medicinal treatments these days?
Yeah, certainly.
Do you believe that cannabis has great medical potential? I mean, you've been studying this longer than most people I know.
Yeah, it is an incredibly versatile treatment for a variety of illnesses and can be used in their treatment very safely if certain safeguards are observed.
Look, I would say it's probably the safest botanical medicine known to man.
Probably not. I mean, but, certainly we've got to admit that it has side effects. Too much THC can produce a lot of problems, but it's true to say there is no dose of cannabis that will cause someone to stop breathing or would be directly toxic to produce their demise. That simply cannot happen.
I mean, it's never killed anybody. Is there any reason to argue with that statement?
That's exactly right. But that psychoactivity can be a florid problem, particularly if we have a naive individual who gets too much THC. They may get what's called a toxic psychosis, where they're paranoid and even hallucinating and end up in the emergency room, incurring great expense and worrying everyone. But this generally responds to talking down, and they should be okay the next day. Additionally, too much THC, particularly in some of the cannabis concentrates like dabs, it can produce what's called orthostatic hypotension. This is a fancy way of saying that they faint. Well, a faint doesn't sound that serious, but people can fall, hit their head, break bones, again, winding up in the ER. So, it's not correct at all to say it has no side effects. It has no deadly side effects, certainly.
I've been studying the side effects of cannabis, Ethan, and everything seems to be temporary. It seems to only last as long as the psychoactivity lasts.
Well, it can be in cannabis if they're the right concomitant ingredients. But as I have frequently said in the past, THC on its own is a lousy drug. It's extremely difficult for people to tolerate, and it has no margin of safety. The difference between the dose that produces the wanted effects like symptom reduction versus those, the adverse events, is very narrow indeed. And that can be broadened considerably if there's some cannabidiol aboard or these other terpenoid components that really modulate the THC and make it a safer medicine.
Well, THC's been mythologized almost. I mean, what's interesting is what you've written about the unpleasant or dysphoric effects of THC. But I'd say in most stoner circles, it's a myth that this is a sunny, happy substance, basically. I think most people think that THC is responsible for the smell of cannabis. Don't you?
Nope. You can have a bucket of THC. I've seen it, smelled it. There's no smell there at all. It is the terpenoids that give cannabis its characteristic aroma.
You see a day where cannabis is ever accepted in the medical world? Do you see doctors ever using it? Do you really think they would go there? Or is there just too much of a divide between pharmacological drugs and botanical medicines?
Well, we need more time. People should be aware that historically, cannabis was a mainstream medicine in the USA, in the U.S. pharmacopoeia for about a century up until 1941. So what we've got now is a historical aberration with cannabis prohibition. But to answer your question, most contemporary physicians have no education on cannabis. Worse than that, how it works via the endocannabinoid system, that isn't even taught in medical school. So we have great ignorance, I'm afraid, of the possible benefits therapeutically. I think this will change over time and maybe spurred on when we finally have a cannabis-based medicine approved by the FDA in this country, which is probably next year when Epidiolex, the cannabidiol treatment for epilepsy, should be approved.
Look, the problem is that it costs $900 a month to get in Europe. That is an unsustainable cost for almost any patient anywhere in the world, especially here where it isn't covered by health insurance.
Well, all that needs to be worked out. We don't know what the cost is going to be. It is likely to be very expensive, and we'll have to see whether that's covered and what happens to the patient that doesn't have insurance coverage. So this is always an issue.
That's a big issue. Are you finding more doctors are coming to you and are curious about cannabis as medicines as these reports seem to grow?
That's certainly the case. I mean, I have been doing this for 20 years, and for many of those early years, I felt like a lonely voice in the wilderness. I think I'm more in demand. You
have a very lonely voice in a very large wilderness. Did you ever think you were really crazy, or that this was a fool's errand?
Oh, Joe, I knew I was crazy to begin with. But it didn't prevent me from persisting in these investigations.
I want to go back to something you told me earlier, which was about the active ingredient in this medicine, that the folks in Peru were dripping into their eyes. What was the active ingredient that they were using to cure their headaches? Did you ever find out?
Yeah, we know that psychotria produces dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, which is a known hallucinogen and is a Schedule I substance in this country and therefore illegal. The ironic thing is tiny amounts of DMT occur naturally in the human brain. So we have the, again, anachronistic situation where a natural brain component is an illegal drug.
This is no different from cannabis, though.
Well, it's slightly, because we don't have THC in our brains unless we put it there. We have analogous compounds such as anandamide, an endogenous cannabinoid, which acts very similarly to THC in the brain. So I guess they're analogous, but they're not exactly the same thing.
Most people, when they hear that the human brain produces a chemical that mirrors THC or is an analog to it, are floored. They actually look at me like I'm really high when I say that.
Sure. Well, physicians too, I'm afraid. Now, the pity there is, let's use this as an example. THC works on the CB1 receptor, the psychoactive receptor in the brain. CB1 additionally modulates the function of all the other neurotransmitters. It is the most common, what we call G protein couple receptor in the brain. And despite that fact, this isn't being taught in medical school. Let's forget cannabis for a moment. Why would you not teach medical students about the most abundant receptor in the brain? Can you think of a legitimate reason?
I think you have a great opportunity in front of you just from talking to people.
Oh, I'm doing my best, Joe.
Ask Alan Howlett, the woman who discovered the endocannabinoid receptors. I asked her, why do you think this isn't taught in medical school? She said, Joe, cannabis is illegal. It really doesn't make any sense to teach doctors about something that they can't prescribe or have any access to. I'm not sure that's a good enough reason, but what do you think?
Well, I think it is a case of guilt by association, and there were people that toyed with the idea of calling it something other than cannabinoid receptors, but it has been almost 30 years, and it's quite ingrained in the literature and in the consciousness. I think we just have to get over these prejudices, and it is the case that understanding and acceptance is much better around the world in many, if not most places, as compared to the US of A.
I think it's a really good interview. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss?
No, I think we hit the high points, so to speak.
That was great. I'm so glad Ethan joined us. He's always a pleasure to talk to.
I could literally listen to that for days.
You are a science geek at heart, whether you know it or not.
Oh, I really am.
I think our next episode, I'm hoping to get a hold of the man who started the Emerald Cup, which is the biggest and best harvest festival in California. I'm very concerned that this year's Cup, I'm not sure what's going on with it because of the fires, and I really want to talk to Tim about it and see what he has to say and give us an update. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to get him that things aren't too upside down on the West Coast, and we'll be able to get him on the show next week so he can fill us in. And by the way, if the Emerald Cup is on, it usually happens in early December, and it is absolutely worth going to California to experience this event. This is not a High Times Cannabis Cup. This is an amazing festival, like a wine festival or a food festival that happens in the it was happening in the Santa Rosa Fairgrounds. It's massive, it's fascinating, it brings together growers, scientists, motorcycle dudes. It's like a 4-H club meets a science expo, and it's really, really fun to attend. So let's hope we can get a hold of Tim, and he'll talk to us next week. And listen, I want to thank everybody again for tuning in. Don't forget to support us on Patreon, please. We need your pennies. But you can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Brave New Weed, or on Facebook.com/Brave New Weed. And be sure to subscribe to us. Tell a friend to listen in. We're growing in leaps and bounds. We're really happy to have you with us. And you can always find us on iTunes or Google Play.
Mm-hmm. And of course, starting now, you can cruise over, and we encourage you to do so. Please go to thefreshtoast.com. We're going to pair up this podcast episode with a lot of other great text information that's going to appear on their website, and we really appreciate them becoming a part of the Brave New Weed family with us.
It's great, isn't it? So until next time, thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Joe.
Good travels.
Dankeschön.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/Brave New Weed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @Brave New Weed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Brave New Weed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.
Hello, faithful podcast listener. I'm the Incredible Jeff.
And I'm the amazing D-Man.
And together, we host Fueled by Deathcast, a weekly podcast show from Death Wish Coffee Company, the makers of the world's strongest coffee.
That's right, and you can find us every Thursday on deathwishcoffee.com, as well as iTunes, Stitcher, Google Music, and more.
And watch us live on the Death Wish Coffee Company Facebook page and check out all our videos on YouTube.
We bring you the latest interesting news in the science world, an exclusive look at the world's strongest coffee company, and a special guest every week.
The guests could be rock stars, actors, authors, athletes, or even astronauts, and we ask them all the question, what fuels you?
So tune in every week to find out the answer, get inspired, and fuel your passion with Fueled by Deathcast.